In 1978, John Carpenter made Halloween, a film that would kick off a whole new subgenre known as the slasher movie. But during this period in the late 70s, there were some other movies that followed a similar narrative to Halloween, about women being targeted in their homes by violent lunatics.
What do you want?
Your blood all over me.
But these films focus less on the slashings and more on the kind of cat and mouse suspense in the tradition of older classics like The Spiral Staircase, Rear Window, or Wait Until Dark. In the same year Carpenter made Halloween, he also made an underrated TV movie about a woman in an LA apartment block being harassed by an obsessive stalker.
I'll find you. I don't give up.
A year later, director Fred Walton would make a film based on the folktale of the babysitter and the man upstairs that remains to this day one of the most frightening and influential films in modern horror.
Hello?
Why haven't you checked the children?
Join me as we continue exploring the evolution of home invasion, and we discuss Someone's Watching Me and When a Stranger Calls. Welcome back to the evolution of horror. My name is Mike Munzer. As ever, I am your host. In this podcast, we explore and dissect the history and the evolution of the horror genre, one subgenre at a time. We are currently in the middle of our 9th season exploring the evolution of home invasion horror, and this is part 12. In this week's episode, as that intro suggested, we are going to be discussing two brilliant movies from the late 70s, Someone's Watching Me from 1978 and When a Stranger Calls from 1979. Both of these discussions will be spoilerific. If you can get hold of these films, please give them both a watch before you listen to our discussion. So joining me to discuss these two classics, a very good friend of mine, a longtime friend of the pod, 1/3 of the Dream Warriors and host of Brain Rot, it's Stevie Webb. Hello, Stevie.
Hello, Mike Munzer. How are you?
I am very good. All the better for seeing you. How are things?
Good. Not too bad. Well, I was just talking to you about whenever I have a few days off work, my body goes, okay, everything we've been holding in, we're just going to let go now. So I just feel like shit. Like every muscle aches, my head hurts, my teeth ache, you know. It's one of those. But it's fine because I've been watching some bangers.
Oh, I know, right? A couple of incredible films to discuss this week. And yeah, let me ask you, I think what's been really nice, actually, there is something, obviously home invasion isn't the most comforting subgenre in the world, but there is something I found quite comforting about sitting on the sofa under a blanket, and particularly these two films, settling in to watch these kind of domestic set cat and mouse thrillers, you know?
Yeah, I think it's the 70s thing as well. I always find 70s films are the ones that you pop on and you don't have to completely invest. You can sort of feel they make you feel quite comfy and very Sunday vibes to them.
Yes, exactly. Especially with obviously one of these which has that kind of made for TV vibe.
Yeah.
There's nothing that's too like jarring about it cinematically. It's quite like stagey and still. And I was quite enjoying it. You know? It was
totally.
Nice. But let me ask you just generally about home invasion, Stevie. Like, are you a fan of like your classic home invasion stuff? Like, I guess the first things people think of in that subgenre are films like Funny Games and The Strangers and that kind of thing. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, it's fucking horrible. Yes, I am a fan, but not in a nice or good way, because I hate it. I mean, you know, lots of the reasons have already been mentioned by your brilliant guests, but it just gets you on a certain level, doesn't it? Because it's your safe space, you know, and the thought of coming home and seeing your fucking front door ajar is knee-buckling. And I personally wouldn't step inside and go, hello, I'd be fucking gone. But it is a broad subgenre, and, you know, what constitutes as home invasion, I suppose. But generally, I find it probably that and Ghosts the most unnerving and affecting setups in film.
Yes, 100%. And I guess, like, why do you think it is that so many people find it the scariest? Is it because it's something that could happen to us, do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think because, you know, the majority of movie watchers have the luxury of having a home. And
Yes.
it's about privacy. It's the place where we lose our self-consciousness, don't we? We can be gross, we can be debauched or naked if we want. And it's where all of our bad habits are set free. You know, it's our freedom. And the home is the only place where we can truly be ourselves without judgment or fear of our secrets being outed. And, you know, for that space to become compromised, that leaves us no sanctuary. So it just makes you feel very alone in the world. The thought of that.
That's such a good point. It's so true. I guess there is something very literally and metaphorically naked about being home, right?
Yeah.
It's like that is in itself is quite
You don't have to put on a front
that.
or anything. And then for that to be challenged is just like there's nowhere else left to go.
Oh my God. Do you think about it generally ever, Stevie? Like, you know, when you're alone in your home, is it something you think about when you like lock your doors and windows at night and that kind of thing?
Do you know what? Because I live in an apartment building with a concierge and there's security patrols. That, honestly, because that's all I ever wanted, because I've always had the fear. Because when I moved to London, you know, I was just told, it's dangerous, you know, don't, you know, that's what you're told when you come from the provinces. You know, you're going to get mugged every week. Your home is going to be broken into every time you go home. And so I had this mortal fear of London. So I lived in fear for a long time. And so the goal was always to live somewhere where I can leave and know that it's going to be okay. I mean, touch wood. But was it you? Yeah, I think, weren't we recording one of our leprechauns or something? And someone had just tried to get into my apartment.
Yes!
And it was bizarre, but there's basically one of our security doors outside is broken, so anyone can come into the sort of communal garden, and someone has been going around checking if doors are unlocked in the building. And I think just before recording with you, someone had gone rattle, rattle, rattle on my door.
No.
And then I ran to the peephole and I saw someone darting around the corner.
Oh, no.
And it just makes you... And then my head... So since then, I have been very sort of religious about locking the door and bolting it and closing it. Because my head then goes... So what was that person's... What was the outcome they were looking for? Were they hoping... It was open, we know that. We were hoping it was open. But were they hoping I wasn't home, like I'd forgotten to lock it? Or were they hoping I was home? And so that just fucked up my head. I was like, what was the outcome they were hoping for? And so, yeah, I mean, I never feel 100% safe. And... I don't think you should.
No.
I think you should always have a little bit of your sort of the wherewithal to be ready.
And the London thing is really funny as well, like living in a city versus, you know, do you think what do you think is scarier, the idea of being in an apartment block like where you are and being surrounded by other human beings that you don't necessarily know that well who are on your doorstep, or living in a house in the middle of nowhere, for example?
Middle of nowhere.
Yeah.
Middle of nowhere. Way more terrible. Way more terrible.
Yeah.
Just like the ratio of people, they can't all be bad in this apartment block. That's what I like to think.
Absolutely.
And actually, that was something, I mean, we'll talk about it shortly, but in Something's Watching Me, what is so realistic and brilliant about it is this person is never more than, a few meters away from another person, just separated by a wall. And yet they feel completely isolated, like they're in a ghost building. Like you barely ever see anyone else, and yet there are hundreds of people within reach. And that's such an interesting thing to tap into, because that's how I feel here. I hardly ever see anyone in my building, and when I do, you kind of go, like, it's like you get a little bit shocked that there's someone else.
Yes, especially in the last few years, right, since COVID, I feel like even more so our homes have become really precious to us as well, and that idea of kind of isolating away from other human beings has become, you know, even bigger deal, I think.
It's just these walls that literally just plaster and wood or metal or whatever it is, just those all connecting makes this little bubble for ourselves where we can sort of hibernate and have what we believe to be our safety. And actually, it's just fucking bricks and mortar, isn't it?
You mentioning, being scared about living in London initially reminded me, because I rewatched recently that really terrible Edgar Wright film Last Night in Soho.
Oh, yeah.
and there are so many lines throughout that film when they're all like, "Oh, lovey, this is Soho. There's crime and danger around every corner." And it's like, no, there's like artisan coffee shops around every corner. It's not like, I don't know what Edgar Wright thinks Soho is like these days, but it's
I know,
crazy.
it's like an American's vision of Soho, isn't it? I know, people, it's so funny because people do think that, and people from New York, I remember I've got friends from New York, and they live in a grid where it's just like it's a mathematical equation to get to somewhere. Whereas Soho, they're like, do you ever get lost? And I'm like, well, I mean, not lost. I wouldn't say lost. Like I'm wandering down. Yeah, I'm not wandering down streets, and they think there's still like it's smoky and there's smog and there's people warming their hands over sort of bins full of fire.
Honestly,
people still have this Dickensian sort of idea of London.
I actually wish it was a bit sleazier still. Soho is now so boring and clean.
Gentrified. Yeah. Yeah, it's ridiculous.
But there you go. So let's get into it. We've got 2 bangers to talk about. We'll go chronologically. So we're gonna start with Someone's Watching Me from 1978. Kind of like forgotten John Carpenter film almost, it feels like, right?
Yeah.
Stevie, set us up. What's the story of Someone's Watching Me?
Okay, so someone is watching me.
It's got to be done.
I had to do
it's got to
that.
be done.
Yeah. So this is about a young live TV director, Lee Michaels, who moves into a new luxury high-rise apartment in LA. It's gorgeous and lush, but it also directly faces a similar building. And so the huge glass facades of these windows face each other. On maybe her second day in the building, she comes home to find the fucking door unlocked. But our Lee is a very confident, fearless woman, and so pops inside and literally says, "Are you still here, Mr. Robber?" Thinking not much of it, she cracks on with her life. She begins to receive some unwanted phone calls, of course, mostly that hang up as soon as she picks up. But then she receives a letter from Excursions Unlimited saying that she has won a vacation to Europe. The location will be revealed to her in a series of clues in the form of presents that will arrive at her apartment. Then a lot of weird shit happens until she eventually starts to feel a little iffy. It takes a lot. And then the drop caller eventually reveals that he is watching her. The police are useless, eventually arrest the wrong guy, and she is left to fend for herself against her stalker, resulting in an incredible tense final act.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So I watched this for the first time for this season. I'd heard a lot about it, and I'd had it recommended to me by people, and I was like, this has definitely got to go on my list. But what about you, Stevie? What's your kind of history with it, and what do you think of the film generally?
Only seen it once before because I got it on Blu-ray, on the Scream Factory Blu-ray. I got that imported from America because it was a blind spot in my John Carpenter history. And I just loved it. And what you were talking about, there's something slightly comforting about that televisual 70s style, but it's also funny because our lead character, Lee Michaels, she is quippy and she's witty. And she says some bizarre things.
Yeah, she's got a weird, and she actually admits she's got a weird sense of humour, right? I love her. Yeah,
which is so, it just feels really refreshing because she's not perfect. Like, she does say some things that make you go, oh, like she has a moment where she says, oh, I have a fantasy about being raped by dwarves. And you go, hang on. Wait, that's not very wholesome.
It's a weird thing to say to a man in a bar. Like...
Yes, that you've just come up to. Touching his leg, going, just making sure you haven't got stilts. Yeah, and so for that reason, she is so captivating and so unusual. She's a really unusual leading lady. And so I just thought it was fantastic. I thought it was structured perfectly. It does have a slightly episodic feel, but that's great. Because that adds to the comfort of the style that we were talking about. And I think it is incredibly... I'm not even going to say underrated because everyone I know who's seen it thinks it's great. It's just under distributed.
Yeah, absolutely. It's true, because I had to get the import as well. I don't think we can actually buy it here in the UK or stream it, can we? Which is such a shame. I watched it for the first time. I've now watched it twice in prep for this, and it's so good. I loved it. And that was the thing that struck me the most as well. Like, yes, it's very well directed. It's John Carpenter. There's some amazing suspense in this, and there are some genuinely jumpy moments as well, which we'll talk about. Yeah. But actually, the thing that really struck me about it was how good the characters are. Like, you just don't... I don't know, you don't necessarily expect to have characters that feel as like real people in the way that they do in a made-for-TV 70s horror film, right? And Lee and Adrienne Barbeau's character as well, I was like, wow, these are characters that feel like real, three-dimensional, and also quite ahead of their time as well, you know? And that really struck me. Yeah.
It's very conversational, and it's very naturalistic. And... even, I know this sounds silly, but just with my actor's head on, even there's so many lines, and I don't know if it was Barbeau's choice or the way it was written, so many lines, she starts to say something and then stops halfway through and then says it again. There's just something really natural about the way they converse that just draws you in. You feel like you're sitting with real people.
It's so incredible. Interesting, and like this movie is so focused on women. In fact, both these films really we're going to talk about are so much about women being targeted, particularly, and what that means, and people that don't believe them, and all of that kind of thing, right? But you know, John Carpenter, I sort of underrate how good a writer he is as well as a director, because this is written and directed by him, right? And you know, you almost think, well, Halloween was it was Deborah Hill that did the kind of the female characters and this kind of thing, but he wrote this entirely himself, and I was like, wow, these sound and feel like real women with jobs and lives and friendships and relationships and quirks and flaws and everything. Yeah. And again, like, I don't know why that should be so impressive, but it kind of is, you know?
Well, I think it is because you're looking at a late 70s straight white male, and you just don't expect it. Just because of what we know and of the time and the era, it doesn't sit where it normally would, and you go, wow. And it does come across as impressive, because I think, you know, before this, Carpenter had only directed Dark Star and Assault on Precinct 13, and he had been working as a screenwriter for hire, and Warner Brothers came to him. They wanted him to write a feature film about this real story that they'd seen in the paper about this woman who was being stalked and watched from the building opposite. And so he wrote it for them to get a paycheck. And they said that they didn't see it as a feature film because it was relatively tame compared to the stuff that was coming out at the time. And so they said, we want to make it TV and we want you to direct it. And so that's how that came about. And it was originally called High Rise. And they shot it in less than 10 days, which is absolutely incredible to me. But, you know, looking at his work at that time in his early days, you know, just 2 weeks after this wrapped, he began shooting Halloween. And I think more than any other, Halloween is the movie that it is most akin to, not just because it is about a female lead being stalked by a mentally unstable man with no sort of clear motive, but because his delivery of tension and the writing, as we were talking about, the writing of that lead female character, she has fight in her. She has her wits about her. She's never depicted as lesser or submissive. And I just love him for that. For both Laurie and Lee, they subvert the stereotype of single females on film at the time.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. You're so true. And I think I kind of maybe wrongly kind of associate John Carpenter more with more kind of male-centric films. I think of The Thing, and I think of all of his Kurt Russell films, and again, Assault on Precinct 13, and but he does an amazing job with these kind of stories as well, you know, and you know, making one of the characters queer as well. Like Adrienne Barbeau's character is gay, but that's kind of also not a thing. It's just kind of part of her character, and it's just accepted. And it's again, it's like, wow, that was just a detail that John Carpenter just added in for the sake of it. You know, it's crazy.
That just blows your mind. That really, because also in 1978, especially on television, you only really saw gay men, and they were vilified or being arrested, you know, stuff like that. And to have this woman who openly says, I'm gay, basically, and for the other woman in question to have absolutely no problem with it, not even question it, I'm like, what year is this?
I know.
It blows my mind, and it's not a plot point. It's just a fact.
Yeah.
And I even now, we don't get that.
No.
It has to be made a big deal of, and it's so bizarre watching something from so long ago, over 40 years ago, that just casually slips it in. But there's an understanding between the two of them. You can see when she says it that it's between us, even though she doesn't have to say that. We have to keep it between us because of, the
world.
fucking world.
Yeah.
But wow, it's so incredible.
It's
I
amazing.
can't believe
That
it.
moment when she just goes, "Oh, who was he?" or something, and she goes, "You mean who was she?"
She,
and then
yeah.
Lee says, "Oh," and she goes, "Oh, don't worry, you're not my type." And then Lee just goes, "I'm not worried." And then they just carry on, and they can just have a normal friendship. And again, I was like, yeah, like you said, I don't think even now you'd get it like that throwaway.
No.
It's amazing.
And it's that line, you're right, when she says, "Don't worry," because she's so used to having to say that whenever she's come out to another woman, because the reaction's been like, "Oh, does that mean you fancy me? Are you looking at me?" She has that immediate knee-jerk reaction to pacify the other person and go, "Don't worry, I'm not a deviant because I'm gay. I'm not going to jump on you." But and then that exchange is just so moving.
Yeah, it is.
That she feels she has to say that, and then the response is, "Oh, no, it didn't even cross my mind."
Yeah, exactly. It is weirdly moving for such a throwaway moment. And there's lovely interviews, aren't there, on the Scream Factory disc? You've got interviews with Carpenter and also Barbeau, and Barbeau talked about that stuff and how she was kind of really proud to be able to play that character, and how people have come up to her since and sort of said what that meant to them, because again, back then that just didn't exist on screen. And again, it's just, it's super cool that John Carpenter just wrote that, because he didn't have to write that. That has nothing to do with anything going on.
Wasn't requested by the studio or anything. It's he completely came up with that, and I honestly, it's so, you say what you want about him now.
Yeah. Grumpy old man.
Grumpy old man, yeah. But looking back at this, and then subsequently Halloween, actually, it makes me look at just the way that's written a little bit more closely. And good on him.
Good on him. Good on him. So what do we think of Carpenter's direction in this? As you said, this was immediately before Halloween. He started making Halloween about 2 weeks after this. Obviously, there are comparisons here in the stories and that kind of thing, but does it feel like a John Carpenter kind of horror film to you in that way?
Yes and no. It feels definitely early Carpenter to me. And as I said, it definitely feels more akin to Halloween, but it does have that televisual style, which I think makes it stand out from his other work. It doesn't feel like he's in his usual wheelhouse. It definitely feels like he's slightly catering to a different audience, but that's not a bad thing.
Yes.
It works in a really effective way, that slightly episodic televisual style, because it makes it more unnerving, especially with a home invasion, because, when you leave the cinema, you leave the movie behind and you come out into the real world. But watching something like this on TV, what do you do afterwards? You turn it off and suddenly you're alone in your home. And I think he nails that, and he knows that. And I mean, I wouldn't say it feels classic Carpenter to me. I think if you showed someone, they wouldn't immediately go, "Oh, this is Carpenter," apart from actually some of the tension, and the build. But it feels like a bit of an anomaly in his career, which I really like.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I was trying to think about this too, like, would you guess it was a Carpenter film? I think the biggest difference is the music, right? I think that it's obviously, like you said,
it's not him.
It's not him. I think that is so much of the John Carpenter fingerprint, isn't it? Is having that synthy, very simple score, which obviously this movie doesn't. It has this like big melodramatic televisual score, doesn't it? And I think that's what makes it feel different. But when you look at the framing of some of it and the lighting, there are some moments like the figures moving past in the background, or the moment when she's under the grate and the kind of the light is shining on her eyes. That felt quite Carpenter-y to me. But I think you're right. Like, we talked about this last year together when we did Tobe Hooper's Salem's Lot in the Vampire series, right? That Tobe Hooper did an amazing job of kind of setting his like fucked up style aside and making something televisual. And I think John Carpenter did this too. He was obviously coming on as a filmmaker for hire to do something televisual. So it doesn't quite feel as authored. It's not got the John Carpenter's The Thing, John Carpenter's Someone Watching Me, does it? But I think there are definitely visuals in this. And actually, even compared to Salem's Lot, which definitely feels like a television play. Like, there are freeze frames and there are ad-break moments. And, this does sort of feel, again, quite cinematic for a TV movie in the 70s as well, you know?
Yeah, and I think that is mainly because it doesn't feel like it stops. It's one continuous problem the entire time, which is, you know, compared to the next film we're going to talk about, is completely opposite. And I think, you know, it starts in one place and then we're there. That is the problem. And it's just one continuous arc from then on. And that feels very cinematic. It doesn't feel like you get ad breaks or where they would be.
Yes.
And just also, you know, I think, Barbeau said on those interviews, the fact that in 1978, if you missed it, you missed it. This was a TV movie. There was no catch-up. There was no going and renting it on Betamax. It was one and done. And to think, I wonder how many we've missed, how many of those TV movies back in the day were of this standard, you know, and need to be unearthed, because I think it's brilliant.
That is such a good point. You're right. You know, like, this is probably one of those films that for years and years and decades, nobody knew about, nobody saw. And of course, John Carpenter himself wasn't really appreciated until much later on as well. So,
That's
you
true.
know, it just really wasn't a big deal to a lot of people at the time. But it is great. Let's talk a little bit about the scares, the tension, because I think there are some brilliantly scary moments in this, even right at the beginning, right? The bit, even looking at the freeze frame of it freaks me out, Stevie, but the moment when the guy breaks into the apartment for the first time to plant the bug, and you just see that quick glimpse of him in black running past while she's on the phone, that is incredible, isn't it, that moment?
It's one of those moments that feels like if this was a film and everyone had seen it, it would be one of those greatest scares in film. It really does, because it's horrible. And I actually watched it in widescreen, even though it feels a little naughty rather than the original aspect ratio. So so it cut off a little bit, but it's just, it's the framing, it's the timing. And I think because she isn't scared, I think that is the juxtaposition, that we're not like, oh, something's about to happen. That's what, you know, because she is reckless, and she's, you know, her confidence is one of the things that makes it so scary, because you're wondering, when is it going to bite her in the arse? Because when you see that person run behind her, you're not ready, because she isn't afraid. And so you're not afraid. And it's just a brilliant tiny moment. And also, it's clearly just a man.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? It's just a man who's in her apartment. And that's awful.
I think that's another thing that I kind of love about both these films, actually, is that there is something kind of mundane about them as well, that they are just these men. And we don't really learn much about them. Well, I guess we do a bit more in the second film, and we sort of learn that actually he's a bit pathetic in a way. But there is also something very unhinged and frightening about them, and I kind of love that. I feel like we don't get many movies like that anymore, and I guess from 1978 onwards, because of John Carpenter, it became more about the sinister man in the mask, whereas there's something about these people that are just blokes that are just kind of hidden in the shadows that is even scarier, I think, in a way. And we don't really get many films like this anymore, it feels like. You know?
Except my favourite film of last year, which was Chloe Okuno's Watcher. And rewatching Someone's Watching Me yesterday or the day before, I suddenly thought, this has got to be a bit of source material, because there is so many similarities about that, you know, that glass facade looking across at all of these other windows where other people inhabit, and just not knowing if anyone's looking in your one while you're looking in someone else's. And I think it must have some inspiration roots.
Absolutely. You can see like a DNA line between sort of Rear Window to this, to Watcher, can't you? Because I remember everyone saying when Watcher came out, oh, it's very Rear Window. But actually, I think you're right. I think it is actually more this film in a way. You know, the way the tension builds, that moment when she will go across the road to the other apartment block and meet this man who may or may not be this sinister guy. Like, there are a lot of comparisons, I think, aren't there? It's so good.
And we never get, like in Halloween, you know, we never get a true understanding of why she was chosen. And it was like in The Strangers, Because You Were Home, you know, that's one of the most terrifying things in horror, isn't it? When motive and specifics aren't relayed to us, because you're like, no, what are you talking about? Why me?
And it almost doesn't really give you the kind of catharsis, because there is a very, very fine line, I suppose, between these home invasion movies we're talking about and then slasher movies, right? I think, but this, it almost doesn't give you the satisfaction or the catharsis of a big gory kill that kind of lets out the tension. Like, it doesn't have that in this movie. We don't even really find out what happens to Adrienne Barbeau. Like, I'm assuming she's dead, but she's never found, right? And like, I don't know, everything is just left so vague and unexplained by the end, and there's something, again, like quite eerie about that. Like, it doesn't ever give you that easy out in a kind of big splattery kind of cathartic way,
Yeah, absolutely. And even at the end, you don't feel like, yay, it's over particularly. It's like, well, if this can happen once, this can happen again. That's just one person. The idea of being watched is just horrible.
That production design too, that production design is great, I think, isn't it? And something we've been talking about every week is kind of the geography of the home itself and what it adds. And this, I think she says it herself, doesn't she, that she's in like the top drawer of a glass box or something. But that is what it feels like. It's like there's windows on every side, right, of this apartment. And I love this feeling. John Carpenter kind of really emphasizes this, where we see her in wide shot a lot. So you're constantly seeing other buildings in the background, and it's like somewhere out there somebody is watching her at all times, it feels like, in this apartment. It's so cool.
It's so exposing, the look of that building, isn't it? She's constantly on show.
Yes.
And as I said, in a building of hundreds of people, and you hardly ever see another soul. And as I say, that's so true to life. You can be surrounded by people meters away and yet feel utterly isolated and alone. And I think it's utilised perfectly, and it encapsulates that incredible feeling of exposure when you're in a private place.
Isn't it funny as well how, like, this is something I've been noticing more and more, and we're going to notice it much more going forward into movies like Parasite and Us. But, like, the wealthier the home, the more glass there is, and the more exposed you are, it feels like, right? Like, whenever you see plush homes in modern American movies, they're like 80% glass, it feels like. And it's like, why would you choose to be... Like, at night, the idea of, like, anyone outside can see in is absolutely terrifying to me. I don't think I'd want one of these, like, big glass houses. Do you know what I mean?
You see it on Selling Sunset, the $45 million homes, and it's just it's a greenhouse, and you're like, fuck, and you're on a hill, so there's people above looking down. Why would you ever want that? Unless you got special glass, that you can't see in. But yeah, you're right. It's a sign of luxury, isn't it?
Yeah, it's like a status thing, isn't it?
Show off the inside of your home from outside. What?
It's horrific, because
if I had millions, I would be in a metal fucking box.
Yeah, I know. It's really weird. Just the idea that you'd be like, yeah, I'm rich and I want everyone to look in at me and see me live my life. No, thank you. Because she is, isn't she? She works in television, and there is this idea that this building is quite an affluent building. Like she says, doesn't she? I live in the Arkham Tower, and someone's like, oh, fancy, like it is, like it's a sought after location and that kind of thing. Yeah. And of course, this is like, again, we'll talk about this with both movies, but it feels like this is when the telephone started to be utilised a lot, right? And we'll talk about this more with the next film, I'm sure. Obviously, this comes after Black Christmas, and I feel like Black Christmas shares a lot of DNA with these two films as well, doesn't it, I think?
Yeah,
but
for sure.
I love, again, I know it's been done to death, not least in Scream movies, right? But there is always something so creepy to me about the kind of sinister voice on the other side of the phone as well, and I think it's used so well in both these films.
Yeah, it totally is. And it just takes me back to a time, because I was around when we didn't have mobiles, and it was just the house phone.
Yeah,
and you're at the mercy of it. That's the only communication in and out, apart from mail. But I mean direct communication, and anyone could just call you, and you don't know who. As when you pick that receiver up, you don't know what's going to be on the other end, and no one will ever understand that now. And there was nothing you could do either. I think that's the thing that comes across the most in both of these, is it's always like, well, if you're not fighting for your life, there's not much we can do. Just don't pick up. And it's like, that's not that's not helpful.
No, you're kind of stuck because it was your only method of communication to the outside world as well. It's like you couldn't unplug that phone because you might need to call the police at any moment as well, right? And not that the police ever believe them in these films or do anything, but like, yeah, there is something very creepy about it. And I guess, again, it's not something that audiences would even comprehend today, but I think you assume that if somebody's calling you, they're not going to be right outside your door. They're not going to be in the apartment opposite watching you. They're probably somewhere far away. And these movies, along with Black Christmas, introduce that idea of like, oh no, what if that person on the other end of the phone can also see you? And again, like, it's hard to think now that was a very new thing, I think, at the time, you know?
Hello?
I got a great idea. How about dinner tomorrow night?
No, Steve. At the tone, the time will be 8:42. Exactly. No date, but at least you know what time it is. Can't take it, huh? Too bad.
It's so effective and it's so brilliant. I think it's just so brilliantly done. You know, the character of Lee is really refreshing to watch, and she is so breathtaking to look at. Lauren Hutton, you know, her eyes are like fucking 12 foot wide.
Yeah.
She's got this beautiful gap in her teeth.
Yeah, she's brilliant, isn't she? She's so watchable because there is so much of the film that is just her. And she does have to go quite big in the second half. There's that amazing moment where she just like collapses onto a table in fear, like, which I loved. And I was like, this is an amazing moment. I want to just keep that as a GIF and use it for various reactions to things.
It's very telenovela.
Yeah,
and,
it is.
And
it is.
That moment at the end, because we have the final scuffle, don't we? Where it's just her and him. I just think that again was true sort of fear. It really, really got me in the way that it does in Watcher when she finally, faces him, and no one else believes, or everyone thinks it's over. You know, it's one of those things where it's only only these two people know it's still happening and it's not over, and it's the fight to the death. And that bit where she's hanging out the window, did you see that she actually did that? Yeah,
that was the only shot, right? So the rest of it was all shot on a television soundstage, right? But that one shot, and you can tell it looks different to everything else, but she's literally
dangerous.
John Carpenter was shooting vertically downwards, right, from the apartment above, and she is literally just hanging out of a 20th story window. Unbelievable. That look is a really chilling shot.
Held on by a rope, apparently.
Yeah, rope.
She's like a rope around her waist. What are you talking about?
Oh, my God. I know. And the killer was just a stuntman, I think, wasn't he, in that shot, so that he was able to kind of pretend like he was trying to push her out, but was actually holding her up. But it's like, fuck me, that is... Yeah, you wouldn't get away with that now.
And it's her. You can see it's her. She's got one foot on the windowsill, the other one's out, and she's just 80% of her body is out the window. It's terrifying. It's brilliant.
Some amazing moments. I also love that sustained tension moment of he's in the garage, he's in the laundry room, all of that sequence when she's hiding under the grate.
That's brilliant, isn't it?
Oh, so
and he's
good, isn't it?
flicking his ash and it's going down onto her face, but she can't react. Oh,
so good.
It's horrible.
And she does the smart thing in most of these situations too. Like, she stays quiet, she doesn't make any noise. Like, she's not a character that you'd be yelling at through the screen, being like, what the fuck are you doing? She does everything she can at every point in this story, it feels like.
Yeah, which is, it goes back to what we were saying about the way it's written. It just feels really refreshing and quite progressive in the way the character is written. Yeah.
And I love the kind of almost kind of detective element that you get in that second half. I guess it feels a bit more TV play, but as they're kind of trying to uncover her and Paul, I think, is it her boyfriend, right? They're trying to kind of uncover who this man is, and they go to the building management and they kind of find out who this guy is and go to his house and everything. But it's got real momentum, I think, in that way.
Yeah, actually, that reveal of who he is, that he's the building inspector, that bothered me, because we blindly do put our trust in people in official positions.
Yes.
My concierge, I know they have keys to my flat.
And you literally said, like, you feel safe because you have that concierge, right? But who knows, I suppose.
And I feel safe that they have access to my flat when I'm not here. And you don't give it a second thought because you are told, we are the people here to protect you. And, and a building inspector, their job is to oversee safety itself. And we just so often blindly hear someone's title and go, they're a safe person. But if we've learned anything from the news, it's the people that get into those jobs mostly that are the most corrupt. The police officers who are corrupt, they go in there because they have access to more things. Or whether it's fucking Jimmy Savile, access to kids. Sorry to bring him up. It's those things where you take
they put themselves in those positions deliberately, right? Yeah. Oh my God. It's so true. And again, like, that's another running theme that I'm kind of spotting as we go with these movies, going all the way back to films like Gaslight. The real horror is already inside your home. It's the husband that you're living with, or it's the doorman, or it's the whoever. It's the person that you should trust the most
the
in
butler.
the place that you should feel safest. Is really terrifying. Have you seen? There's a great Spanish horror film from 2011 called Sleep Tight, which is about that. I don't know if you've seen that, Stevie.
No, I haven't.
Oh God, it's very tense. But it is literally about a concierge man in a plush apartment block who becomes obsessed with a woman, and he begins breaking into her apartment at night, and he literally like sleeps under her bed so that he can be near her. And it's really creepy. And the creepiest thing about it is that we are aligned with him and not her, so we find ourselves almost tense that he's going to get caught in these moments when he will creep into her apartment at night
almost
and stuff.
Complicit.
Yeah, it's a very disturbing movie, but that is along sort of similar lines as this. But it's great, isn't it? And I think in comparison to that, this movie reveals very little about this man. I mean, do we even ever properly see his face? I don't know if we do we?
Only in the sort of the scuffle towards the end, we get a shot when he's in her apartment.
Yes, that's right.
And he comes out of the cupboard. But not really. I mean, and again, that feels very Carpenter.
Yes, it does.
To leave us not having a clue why or who this person really is and their motive.
What a banger. And do you know what else I love about both these films? It doesn't waste any time, straight to end credits as soon as the action's done, right?
Yeah, we don't need a cool down. It's not like, this is what happened after. It's like, this was the event. Over. Go home.
So good. He falls off the building, and then I think she says something like, "You got too close."
Yes.
And then it ends, right?
You got too close.
Love it. What a film. How do you think it holds up? Like, is this, again, it feels criminally underseen, doesn't it, I think? But how do you think it holds up, years later almost?
Well, I mean, we've just said so many things that we were blown away by or that was incredibly surprising. And I think it's absolutely brilliant. I really do. And I think any Carpenter fan really needs to make sure they see it. But also, if you think you know Carpenter, give it a go. And you don't particularly like his work. I mean, who doesn't?
Yes.
But it's a really strange little anomaly. And I think when your favourite band suddenly becomes big, there's also that I feel a little bit protective about it as well, because I kind of don't want everyone to know about it.
Yeah. I know, you're right. You're absolutely right. It's so true. And I think it holds up so well. I think for all the reasons we've mentioned, it was like insanely ahead of its time, especially for something made for network television.
Right.
And it's got those moments of Carpenter genius. If I could improve one thing, I would say let's rescore it with a Carpenter score, right? Like, I think that would be the icing on the cake for this movie. But otherwise, it's awesome.
It's pretty flawless.
バトルロワイヤルの正しい戦い方監修 BR 法推進委員会白岩学園3年 B 組の皆さんこんにちは。
はい、こんにちは。
That was a clip you just heard there from one of my favourite films of all time. In fact, it was actually in my Sight and Sound top 10 list last year, the brilliant Battle Royale from the year 2000. And that's what we've got going on over on Patreon this week for $10 patrons. Over on Patreon, we do this kind of long-running international horror strand where once a month or so, we will take a different country from around the world, look at its horror traditions, its horror history, and then we discuss one movie from that country in depth. So this week, I was joined by friend of the pod, Tim Coleman, and we dived deep into the world of Japanese horror. So we discuss a little bit about the history of Japanese folklore and horror, we discuss a bunch of recommendations, and then we finish the episode with a deep dive of the masterpiece that is Battle Royale. So if you want to check that out, as well as a whole bunch of other great international horror episodes over the last couple of years, we've covered Spanish horror, Nordic horror, Korean horror, Czech horror, Australian horror, and Italian horror, and there's so much more to cover. That is one of many, many strands that are available for $10 patrons on Patreon. If you sign up at a $5 level, you won't get those, but you will get access to our monthly Fresh Blood strand, in which we review all new releases available in the world of horror. So sign up now, patreon.com/evolution of horror. Everybody who signs up, no matter what tier, will also get a little shout out on the main podcast as a thank you. So speaking of, I'm going to give everybody who signed up in the month of May a little thank you. So a big thanks to Jennifer Manchelenko, Lou Smith, Edward Broderick, Sarah Tenenbaum, Samuel Watkins, Nils Matson, Henry Rice, Chloe Warian, Matthew Webb, Brandon Allen, Katie Joyner, Teddy O'Hay, Steve Herr, Lee, Daniel Dietrich, Dan Carver, Janine Mikhail, Heather, Angel Figueroa, Lily von Stupp, David Metzer-Kappa, Memes in Curry Sauce, Kat Jones, Jonathan, Nathan Woods, Daniel Ellis, Heather Stone, Jason Burse, Maddie W, Jill Key, and Angela Smith. A huge thank you to all of those people for signing up to Patreon. And if you want to join them, if you want to help support the making of this podcast and get treated to regular bonus content and more, then sign up now. Patreon.com/evolution of horror. That's patreon.com/evolution of horror.
As I was walking down by the Royal Arsenal, early the morning, was the day.
Please show yourself again. That is a clip from one of my personal favourite and scariest horror films over the last 20 years or so, The Borderlands from 2013. This is the weird British found footage folk horror movie produced by Jen Handorf, friend of the pod, and with practical effects by her husband Dan Martin, also of course longtime friend of the pod. And if you have never seen that film, or even if you have seen that film and you are within reach of London, we have got a very special event coming up in July to celebrate the film's 10th anniversary. We're going to be screening it at a very special screening at the Genesis Cinema in London, 18th of July. I will be there to introduce and host a special screening of The Borderlands. I will be joined by Jen Handorf, Dan Martin, and other people involved in the film for a very special panel after the film, and then we'll all be hanging out and having drinks afterwards. So if you have seen this film, or if you haven't, I think it's going to be a really special night. Please do grab a ticket while you can. Come and hang out with me and Jen Handorf and Dan Martin and watch this genuinely terrifying found footage movie with an audience on the big screen. If you head to evolutionofhorror.com/events, you will see there everything that we've got coming up both in and outside of London, and links to various ticket pages. And we're always announcing new stuff. So if you want to be kept abreast of what we've got coming up, the best thing to do is actually to sign up to our newsletter, evolutionofhorror.com/newsletter. If you just input your details, we will send you monthly updates of what we've got coming up in and around the UK or online for you to check out, because we're doing so many events both online and in person around the UK this year. So if you don't want to miss out, sign up to our newsletter and keep an eye on our events page. In the next couple of weeks, we're going to be in Cardiff to host a 40th anniversary screening of Videodrome, followed by a live panel discussion, which is going to be incredible. We've also got a special 40th anniversary screening of Psycho 2. We're going to be hosting a special horror pub quiz before it with merch giveaways, so that's happening as well. And we've got loads of stuff that is going to be announced very soon happening in October. We are going to be coming to the north of England to do a little tour of various locations, including Manchester, Newcastle, Liverpool and Edinburgh. So again, if you don't want to miss out on all of that, evolutionofhorror.com/newsletter. Okay, let's return to the second half of this week's episode as Stevie Webb and I dive deep into a movie that I think is pretty underrated and really fucking scary. This is When a Stranger Calls from 1979.
Hello.
It's me.
I'm not going to be here much longer. Dr. Mandrakis and his wife are coming home.
I know.
Sorry, I turned the lights down. Turn them back up if you like.
Don't.
Don't. You really scared me. If that's what you wanted. Is that what you wanted?
No.
What do you want?
Your blood all over me.
Stevie, this plot, it's got such a bizarre plot, hasn't it? But tell us a little bit about the plot of When a Stranger Calls.
Well, okay, I'm going to try and do this in one synopsis. Okay, so...
Yes.
So, Jill Johnson, babysitter for the Mandrakises, remember that name? Receives a call while alone in the living room, and the children upstairs, and a strained British voice asks, "Have you checked the children?"
Oh, that's good.
She hasn't, and doesn't for quite some time, but the calls become more and more frequent, and so Jill informs the police, who decide to trace the call. Eventually, at the peak of the tension and the phone calls, the police inform her that the call is coming from inside the house. The upstairs door opens, a tall shadow moves across the wall, and then someone leans on the TV remote, and we switch to a different channel for an hour to a movie where Detective Clifford, 7 years later, hears that the same man from 7 years before at the Mandrakis' house has escaped his asylum, and so he redirects his entire life and career to hunt down the escaped Kurt Duncan, armed with 2 syringe needles that he intends to use like throwing knives in a cat and mouse police thriller. Then, 15 minutes before the end, someone leans on the remote again, and we're back with Jill 7 years later, where Kurt is now terrorizing her in a similar fashion to all those years before.
Yes, like... What on earth? Structurally, this movie is absolutely insane, isn't it? Which we'll get into. First of all, just tell me a bit about your This feels like one of those really iconic movies, right? Like I feel like I heard about this movie, from when I was a child. There's that classic kind of folkloric babysitter upstairs, and the man upstairs vibe to it. But when did you first kind of come to this film, Stevie?
It was 2007, and I was on tour with a play called The History Boys. And obviously, I'm a huge horror fan, but I hadn't seen it. And someone asked me on the tour, "Have you seen When a Stranger Calls?" And they said, and I was like, oh, what's that one? And they said, it's where the phone's coming from inside the house. And I was like, oh yeah, no, I've definitely seen that, because you immediately think you have. And it's happened in other films. And there is also the urban legend. And so we all as a cast sat down to watch it. And that first 20 minutes shook me. And it still does to this day. And I just, as a film, yes, I love it. As we just mentioned, it's a little structurally odd, because obviously, we'll talk about it. Obviously, it was originally a short film, the opening. But I truly think that opening scene, and even the ending in some way, is an absolute masterclass in the marriage of tension, sound design, camera angles.
Yeah.
And it's literally perfection. There's not a single time I've watched it and not felt utter despair and fear. I've shown several people just that opening, just that short film at the beginning, and then just left it there. And that's not to say I don't enjoy the whole movie, but that mini movie at the start is honestly one of the most incredible pieces of genre filmmaking ever made, in my opinion. And it's actually very simple as well in its content, but boy, does it fucking smack. You know, even when you know the twist, shall we call it, it still works, because, you know, the police on the other end are saying, just stay where you are, you're safe there, the best place to be is inside the house. And so it actually caters to rewatch. They've made it so that when you do watch it again, the knowledge you have makes it almost worse, and it's stomach flipping.
Yes, I could not agree more. I think it is. The film isn't perfect as a whole, but my God, I've never seen anything more perfect than that first 20 minutes of this film. Like, it is absolute horror perfection. Like you said, there is nothing about it. The cinematography, the way every shot, you know, absolutely terrifies me, because I think something is going on in the background all the time. The performance, Carol Kane, the voice over the phone, the way it builds, the surprise at the end, the shadow at the top of the stairs, like, it's just like horror perfection, I think. It's one of the most genuinely terrifying things I've ever seen. And every time I watch it, I think it is just as terrifying as any other time I've seen it. And do you know what? I love this film, and I do agree with people, and I know everyone says this, that it does have this big dip in the middle section. It does, but actually,
As its own thing.
Yeah, I sort of like it. It's like a really weird, sleazy, grindhousey. I don't know. It almost feels a bit grindhouse, a bit giallo, a bit maniac, or something like. There's something about it that is like, I actually find in a kind of different way, a kind of psychological genre exploitation kind of vibe way. I actually think it's really great as well, and I think the performance of the killer, the stranger, Tony Beckley as Kurt Duncan, because it sort of becomes his movie in the second section of the film, I think is really great, because he's got this very, very unhinged, you know, dangerous way about him, and I loved all of that stuff. And then it goes right back to the classic tension of the opening in the final act, as you said in your synopsis. And yes, it's a bit all over the place narratively, but actually I do think that the whole experience of watching it is just incredibly tense, queasy, uneasy, and again, this kind of like quiet scare that I don't feel like we get much in movies anymore. You know, I love it to pieces. It's great.
No, I do like it as a whole. I really do. And you know, it just because that opening stands out so much comparatively, nothing can touch it. But
of course,
as one film, it absolutely does work. It's very strange, and as you say, I think it's because of the change of direction and pace, and the focus is so completely different in that middle section that it can feel jarring, but there's something really unsettling about it. It's what you touched on, that sort of grindhouse feel or maniac, where it's just this slightly disheveled person sort of moving from place to place in a very dirty, scuzzy sort of environment, and this hell-bent detective in a very Loomis way, actually. Who I think the most jarring thing for me is, and then kind of, I suppose it's one of the things that could work for some people, is we're given two people who are we're told they're not acting as themselves. So the detective's gone a bit rogue and he's suddenly like hyper-focused on this one person.
Yes.
And then we've got the killer, we've got Kurt, who is still sort of feeling the effects of his meds. So he's subdued and he's not the person that he usually would be. And so we're following two people that we actually have no outer context of. Like, we don't know what they're usually like, but we're being told they're not usually like this. And so I think it's a really weird thing to ask of the audience for us to go, oh, right, yeah, they've both gone rogue, or it just feels very odd that we don't get any context either side of what they were like before this situation.
I think you're right. I think you're absolutely right. And I think for me that works for Kurt, because I think it makes him even more unpredictable. Like,
we don't know
you don't understand. Like, I think there's something about that kind of character, and it feels quite real to me that he is this genuinely kind of mentally ill man who at times seems quite vulnerable. Like, you see him get beaten up in that bar, and he's quite sort of pathetic, right? He's kind of he's homeless, and he's trying to find somewhere to stay, and he's kind of drifting from place to place, and he's physically. He doesn't actually seem that impending or imposing, like, you know. But then other times,
sorry to interrupt. Well, Tony Beckley was terminally ill.
No way! I didn't know that. Yeah, and I think that's what's coming through, and it really, obviously, it works. But he was terminally ill, and they decided, no, we want to see it through. We're not going to recast it, and he died not long after completing the shoot. So it is a man who is struggling and is ill and is weak, and so that, I think, exactly what you're talking about, it lends to it, and it makes him so vulnerable. Oh my God, that's probably partly what makes it feel so strange, seeing his performance. It's like that, who I know you love, Stevie, in Poltergeist 2, right? That man who was the actor that was dying of cancer.
Right, Reverend Kane, yeah.
It does add a certain something, because these people do look unwell in different kinds of ways, not just in a way that are kind of like, you know, classic movie lunatic looks, you know. So there is this really interesting thing, I think, of he has this vulnerability about him, but then he gets alone in an apartment with that woman and the doors closes, and you suddenly go, oh my God, as she does too, where she kind of almost feels sorry for him. And then they get alone in the apartment together, and it's like those red flags raise, and you go, oh my God, this is not safe. And I think that stuff is done really well. Like, I really believe it. I question her reaction to it all, because, you know, he's come on to her in the bar quite forcefully. She's watched him get absolutely beaten up. And then the first thing I would think is, well, that guy's going to have it in for me. Right. And then she walks all the way home, which isn't next door. It's a while away. And then he's in her apartment block, and she goes, oh, it's you. And I was like, hang on, love. You should be a little bit more concerned. But yeah, she kind of lets him into the apartment, and then, and I'm not saying she deserves anything bad. But you're right. She's very trusting. Yes. Yeah, I think actually that's another thing that's interesting about their dynamic, though, is that she's quite. I don't know. There's something about her that seems. Yes, there's something about her that seems less vulnerable than him, and she's got this kind of like independent way about her. She's got that amazing gravelly voice, and she does have this kind of "don't fuck with me" kind of like way
a madam,
about her.
That sort of like a 70s madam who will fuck with you if you fuck with her girls. You know, that's the sort of thing we see in those films.
Oh, it's you. What do you want?
I came to apologize.
Listen, I'm the one who should be sorry. I didn't mean for that to happen.
I'm new in town. I don't know anybody.
Where are you from? Excuse me.
Until you can see that she gets a bit like, maybe something's a little bit iffy here.
Yeah, and it's you're right, you know, she doesn't do the right thing, but also I could sort of believe something like that happening to a person, you know, like I can believe that in that kind of awkward moment she might say, oh, come in then, you know. It's like it's that sort of stuff that I find very disturbing and upsetting because
Yeah.
you're like, oh God, yeah, this is the sort of thing that probably happens, you know?
And of course, we've had the exposition from the nurse in that quite amusing scene with Clifford and the nurse, where she's goes, well, look, he's you know, it's all a bit heavy-handed. It's like, yes, he's on medication, so his actual tendencies won't be with him at the moment, but it will wear off, and so at some point he is going to, you know, we get that, but we do get that wonderful. So we know it's going to wear off, but we also know that he's kind of unaware of who he is, which is scary, which is a scary thing, knowing it's a ticking time bomb. That's what we're told. And that is a scary thought, because we get the wonderful, almost beautiful mirror scene where he strips off and he's looking in the mirror, and we've had that exposition, and he starts to have flashbacks, and we actually get a little flash of, because we never see the upstairs
Oh my God.
with the kids.
No.
Because we just have to hear that he has absolutely mutilated them with his bare hands. He has torn these children
that
apart.
description of what he does to
my
the
God,
children.
it's the worst.
Honestly, like, it's so chilling, and it doesn't matter that we haven't seen any of it, but you're right, it's like they couldn't piece the bodies back together of these children in order to even give them a proper burial, and he didn't even use a weapon, he used his hand. Like, what the hell?
7 years ago, he murdered 2 children. Broke into the house and found them asleep in bed. There was a little boy, 4.5, and his little 3-year-old sister. After the coroner's investigation, the bodies were taken to the mortuary, where the undertaker took one look at them and said their bodies couldn't be reconstructed for the burial without 6 days of steady work. Then he asked what had been the murder weapon, because looking at the mess in front of him, he couldn't imagine what had been used. The coroner told him there had been no murder weapon. The killer had used only his hands.
Even in his, like, vulnerable state, knowing the whole time
That's what he's capable of,
right? And that he's this kind of, like, ticking time bomb. And you're right, yeah, that shot in the mirror is chilling, very chilling.
Yeah, because we get a really, it's almost subliminal, this flash of him covered in blood, sat on the bed. And obviously, from what we know, that's the kid's blood, and that's the moment. And he starts to sort of come to, I guess. And that's where we're like, okay, now fuck. Okay, so
Yeah.
this is gonna go south from now on. So get your fucking lock needles. What can we talk about that?
Yeah, what the hell?
That's
what
the whole the hostel sequence, I think, is both brilliant and hilarious.
Yeah.
Because he's in the hostel, and then you've got the great bit of the Clifford coming in, all of these bunk beds, and he's like searching for him, and then the very long sequence of him walking down the corridor, of him going, come out, I'm gonna help you, the Mandrakas. Does he say the Mandrakas said, I need to take you back? Now, is that real, or does he think that's what he wants to hear? I didn't quite understand that.
Yeah, I don't know. No, it's all
I was
so
confused.
weird, isn't it? Yeah.
It's a little surreal. And then, so he's told his superior, he says, how are you going to, because I want to kill him. How are you going to kill him? Lock needles. So there's me. Hang on.
What?
Pause. Let me just double check. What are lock needles? It's not. No, it is what it sounds like. It is the end of a syringe. It is the bit you screw on with the needle. So he's armed himself with just 2 long metal needles, and this is going to be his method of murder. And so he has the moment where he has him in front of him, and he goes like, hi-ya, basically. And he like a throwing dart, flips this needle, and it goes bang into the wall. And Alexa, stop. She doesn't know. I think she just looked up lock needles. And he's like, darn it. Like, he got away because you threw a needle at him. What am I watching here? And then, leaving the hostel, he bursts the doors off their hinges, Clifford, as he bursts through them like he's some sort of kaiju. I think it's hilarious. I don't know what's happening. When you look at this section alone and think, 40 minutes ago was that masterpiece of genre tension. And now I'm watching a guy, a sort of overweight, middle-aged cop throwing needles at an English guy who's running around going, "Ooh!"
It's very strange. You're right. And it's just a weird choice of hero, that this kind of like older, overweight cop as well, with this vendetta. It's hilarious. You're absolutely right. And this is the thing. And I get that people have complaints about that middle section. It is a bit weird and all over the place. But I think for me, what saves it is that incredible performance of Kurt, that Tony Beckley performance. I think for me, it really kind of holds it together because he's just so fucking weird. And actually, again, another thing that I kind of love about Fred Walton's direction, and this is the same in the sequel too, that he really takes his time. There's a lot of sequences in this middle section of just people walking, right?
Just cat and mouse,
being followed, being stalked. And you're either going to be in that or you're not. And it's hard these days not to like want to glimpse at your phone during those moments or whatever, right? But I think if you don't and you really immerse yourself in this, I think it's really great suspense as well. And again, the sort of thing that, I don't know, the kind of patient horror filmmaking that I feel like we don't quite get so much these days as well, you know?
That's a really good point. And I think what's most interesting about it is the cop's the dangerous one. And the quote-unquote bad guy is the meek, vulnerable one. And it's just a really interesting dynamic to watch because you kind of don't know whose side you're on because you're being a little bit crazy and a bit harsh, Mr. Cop. This poor man's just got out of an asylum and, you know, he doesn't know really who he is. He hasn't got anywhere to live. But of course, you're like, oh no, fuck, he ripped kids up with his hands. So it's great. But as you say, all those cat and mouse elongated sections of stalking, I think they are great. And as you say, if you have the patience for it, it really does pay off.
Yeah, again, there is something... Watcher had this actually last year, and that was what made Watcher feel quite different, and it did almost feel old-fashioned in a lovely way, Watcher, you know, compared to a lot of other horror films we get these days. And I really love it when films effectively kind of take their time with that kind of cat and mouse tension. And we should go back. I mean, we only sort of briefly mentioned it, but we should talk about that first 20 minutes. And we've talked about that iffy middle section. That first 20 minutes is such a masterstroke. And as you said, Stevie, it began life as a short film, right? Is that right? And obviously you can very much tell that it's a short film with an additional hour tacked on to the end of it, isn't it?
Just so many moments. I think, do you know, honestly, the most terrifying thing for me is the music. What? Not crescendo. What's the opposite? What's the downward one? Yeah. What do you call that?
Yeah. Is it just
not a swell?
Is it not just a decrescendo?
Decrescendo.
Or maybe,
yes. Yeah. The strings of the and it completely. It's the manifestation of what your stomach feels, and it feels like, you know, that moment on a roller coaster when it drops and your stomach just becomes weightless for a second. And every time one of those stings is in there, it is a moment when your stomach does that, and it just adds to it, and it is absolute perfection.
Hello?
Why haven't you checked the children?
Yeah. The sound design is perfection. Everything from the voice on the phone to the silences to those musical chords, like that moment, like you quoted, when he goes, "Why haven't you checked the children?" And then bang, that drop of like, holy shit, are they dead upstairs? You know, is it's just a masterstroke, isn't it? And again, like, it's hard in a way now to think of this as not being so cliched, right? Like you said, you feel like you've seen this even if you haven't seen it. The babysitter receiving menacing phone calls. It's Halloween, it's Scream, it's, you know, Urban Legend, it's Black Christmas, it's 1,000,001 films. But I forget almost just how effectively this film does it. Like, it is truly, like, it is almost up there with the opening scene of Scream with Drew Barrymore, right? And Wes Craven has said 100%. He was influenced by this opening scene when he made Scream. So, yeah, it's so interesting.
And it's just masterful because it is incredibly simple. You know, the guy on the phone never says anything other than that one sentence, and in all the others it's either conversation. You know, in Billy in Black Christmas, he's saying it's obscene phone calls. In Scream, it's lulling into a sense of security. Whereas in this, it is just one chilling sentence that could mean all sorts of things. Does it mean the kids are dead? Is it a trick to make me go upstairs? You know, I just think it's just so brilliant. And the conversations with the police feel so natural. I mean, we should talk about Carol Kane because obviously she's known much more now as, you know, a character actor or a comedy actress, whether it be from Addams Family or Kimmy Schmidt and stuff like that. But the realism in watching her journey of emotion, I just don't think you can't compare it. It's unparalleled because she expresses everything that you feel within that moment, and it feels genuine.
Yeah, I completely agree. There's something about her look and her face too that is like, I don't know that. Yeah, there's true fear. Like there are moments when it just looks like she goes white, like she goes pale at times, you know, like it's all in her face, like true fear in her eyes at those moments as well, you know.
It's that combination. I think it's the moment where we hear something in the kitchen. It turns out to be the icebox, but you get a triple whammy. You get the noise, you get the
yes,
and her face, and then the camera sweeps round as if it was on a pole attached to her head. So as she looks, the camera sweeps with her face. So we constantly stay on her face as it turns, and it just does something. And it's just this perfect concoction of technical moments that it just I can't speak highly enough of how well structured this opening is.
And again, it's such an exercise in restraint. Fred Walton is amazing at restraint. Again, like we talked about that middle section with those like long moments that he lets linger, and the same in this. Like we never have that big burst of violence where the killer will eventually attack her. Like,
no.
And I find myself constantly looking, you know, those beautiful shots in this shadowy house of her sitting on the phone, but she's always placed to the side of the frame. And so you're looking at everything behind her, that staircase going up to that dark, shadowy upstairs landing. And you're constantly being like, did I just see something move? Did something happen there? You know, and it does. The way it plays with all of your senses from the very beginning. Again, I just feel like not enough people talk about how good Fred Walton is at directing this stuff. You know, it's phenomenal.
Yeah, there's no safe framing. There's no framing where you feel like you can relax. You have to be on high alert the entire time. And, you know, and every time the phone rings, he made it louder, Walton. He, you know, so every single time the phone rings, he turns up the volume of the ringing so that by the last few, it is shrill and it is almost painful to the ear. And just that alone, you don't realize that's happening. But when you know, you're like, oh fuck, that's had an effect on me, of course, because it's been building. It's so genius.
That makes such a lot of sense. And both these films, there is something kind of jarring about that phone ringing noise, right? It's so loud and it's so intrusive in both these films. And yeah, that really is a kind of great sort of punctuation mark. And you know, again, the few lines that he says, that weird moment, because again, there's this kind of weird panic in his voice at times when she says, "Shall I turn the lights on?" And he's like, "Don't," and stuff, and it's why? And you know, what do you want? I want your blood all over me. And suddenly it sounds a bit kind of almost sexual as well, and it's like it's so creepy and unnerving. It's just brilliant.
It is. There is something kink about the way he says it. All over me.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that we see also in Scream with, you know, I want to, what is it? I want to see what your insides look like.
Yes, exactly.
You know, that feels very much taken from that.
It's true. And actually, because Scream, you know, Scream, as masterful as that is, it has moments of, okay, now it's going to relax for a moment, even in that Drew Barrymore sequence, or here it's just a little bit playful, she's talking about horror movies or whatever, and there's jokes and stuff.
Making popcorn.
Yeah, whereas you're absolutely right, in this, there's no like let up, like it doesn't for that solid 20 minutes, you're just like holding your breath, basically, aren't you? It's incredible stuff.
Totally.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there you go. And then what do you think of the way we then switch back to Carol Kane at the end, and we go back to now she's left a babysitter looking after her children, right? And then he comes for her in her home. What do you think of that final act?
I think it works. I really do. It's a nice little bookend. And there's something about the fact that she gets the call while they're at this fancy dinner, and there's distance between her, and all she needs to hear is that sentence of "Have you checked the children?" and her entire world falls apart, and she's like, I know what's going on, and she's got a preconceived idea, and of course that's not what's happened, and so then we're into this false sense of security again, and we get that again. I think it's brilliant and terrifying, where she thinks she's checked absolutely everything, she's finally been left alone, and she gets into bed, and we are misdirected with his voice. You can't see me, and back, and she's looking at this crack in the door, and it's slowly zooming, and it's the same, because obviously that's the direction of where she can hear this voice. And then he's fucking in bed with her.
Oh my God.
It's
that reveal of his
horrible.
face in her bed. It's so good.
It's so good.
I loved it so much. That jump scare really got me.
Yeah.
It is brutal. I loved it. And again, I just love it. These kind of shots. It's like Black Christmas too. I mean, it's very Black Christmas, but that
Billy
kind
with
of
the eye, yeah.
That zoom into a closed or a slightly ajar door or a cupboard door, whatever, that is like catnip for me. All of those kinds of shots, of like, can we see something? Can we not? Is the sound coming from here? Is it coming from somewhere else? That stuff is just so good, I think, at creating fear and tension.
Yeah. And you just see her at the very end when, the police have shot him. And that's it now for life. She's fucked. It's like, okay, it's happened again. And she's sort of screaming, crying, and then just suddenly stops and then screams again, and you can just see, right, this is lifelong trauma. She's never ever going to be the same again, and it's just awful. But also, we don't know why he's gone back to her.
Why is he targeting her? Yeah,
he's tracked her down. He's found. Well, I mean, it's a bit of a stretch. Like, he's found the restaurant she's eating in and the phone number. And
yeah, he's done a lot of prep here.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, we'll sweep that under the carpet. But again, it leaves us with questions, which is what both of these brilliant films do, is they don't wrap up in a nice way for us.
Totally.
They both may be dead, but you need answers. That doesn't mean you're going to rest easy because it's technically over. It'll never be over because you never know why.
We can never quite understand that guy. Why did he mutilate 2 children?
Right.
Why was he then after women? Like, what is his deal? What's his MO, if any? It's all extremely upsetting. I love it so much. And, this film's legacy is so interesting, isn't it? Because I think, it doesn't have the same reputation as Halloween, Black Christmas, Scream, and I think because it's a little bit more clunky, isn't it? And so I feel like almost this movie is kind of underappreciated in a weird way, even though everyone sort of has heard of it. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, and I totally get why.
Yeah.
Because, as a cohesive movie, it's not the easiest watch.
No.
But with the right appreciation, I think it's blinding from start to finish.
Interesting. Fred Walton then went on to make 80s slasher April Fool's Day, right, in 1986, which is an interesting change of direction. But then, of course, we get a sequel to this movie, which I'm going to talk about in depth next week. But I just want to briefly hear your thoughts, Stevie. Quite a few years later, 1993, right?
Yeah.
So 14 years on. But it brings back the main cast and the director. What do you think of the sequel?
I think it's trashy. I think it's very 90s. It's brilliant. Seeing Carol Kane, contrary to what I just said, but seeing her sort of rise up against her foe.
So good.
It's fun. It's a lot of fun. It's definitely not. It doesn't have the masterful moments of the first one, but as a fun, more cohesive sequel, I think it's great.
I love it too. Yeah, like I had it recommended to me by so many people, like who were like, it's better than the first one. I don't know if it's better than the first one. Well, maybe it's more consistent than the first one. I think in some ways it kind of corrects some of the mistakes of the first movie in that we stay with Carol Kane and our other main character the whole way through, and it kind of keeps that suspense going pretty much. It's more sustained, isn't it, I think? Definitely. But nothing quite matches up to the opening scene of the first film. But and it does go a bit more mental, and I think it has a lot of fun with what I was just saying before about you don't quite know where the killer is, where the sounds are coming from, where the voices are coming from, right? And it's dealt with in a really silly way, but I sort of loved it still. You know?
Yeah. It's great. I mean, it's right up my street.
Yeah, I bet it is. But it's like, I do really think, like, hats off to these films, even though they are a bit all over the place at times. There are moments of absolute genius that is better than any other horror, you know, I've ever seen, you know. So it's such an interesting kind of mixed bag, isn't it, in that way?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Have you seen the remake?
I haven't. No, that's Jennifer Lawrence, isn't it?
No.
Oh, is it not? Oh no, that's someone. That's the other one.
Did,
House at the End of the Lane, or whatever it is.
House at the End of the Lane. Yeah, one of those. No, oh God, Mike, it's not good, because they've you know, updated it so she's got a cell phone, and it's in one of those houses that we were talking about, one of those sort of posh glass houses, and oh my goodness, it's really not good.
It's such a shame. Well, maybe it's just the sort of thing that just can't work anymore because of cell phones and stuff.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Because of technology, and they try and get around that, but nope.
It was in that awful era, wasn't it? 2006, when we were getting everything remade badly.
All the remakes.
Yes.
Yeah. It's terrible.
No, thank you. Well, there you go. So I think that's it. I mean, like, incredible movies to discuss, really fun films to discuss.
I lucked out.
Oh God, right? So much fun. And let me just finish by asking you, Stevie, if you have a favourite in this weird subgenre of home invasion, what would it be? What's your favourite home invasion movie?
If I was allowed to say The Sitter, which is the original 20-minute short film from the beginning of this, I would say that. But because originally that's what it was just called, The Sitter. But as for, in terms of full movies, I think The Strangers is up there. I think it's truly terrifying. But I think, are you counting Misery?
Yes.
That then. It's got to be Misery.
Yes, right.
Because it's so theatrical. It is so heightened. It is melodramatic. It is genius. And it is really, really true to the book. And I think it's a masterpiece.
It's perfect, isn't it? It's one of those films. We talked about sustained dread in this film. Misery is somehow hilarious and terrifying at the same time, right? Yeah. With Kathy Bates' performance, where it, like you said, it's larger than life. It's almost campy at times, but also it's fucking terrifying. It's such a good movie. Yeah.
It'd have to be Misery, I'd say.
Amazing. Well, Stevie, thank you so much. What a joy, as ever, it's been to discuss these films with you. Let people know where they can find you, more of your stuff. When is Brain Rot returning?
Yes, so Brain Rot, my 80s horror podcast, my trash cast, is it's coming back towards the end of this month in June. I'm just shaping it up at the moment, and I've told you a couple of the guests who are ridiculously exciting. I'm literally
holy shit.
My hero is coming on the show, but more from that soon. But you can find Brain Rot wherever you listen to your podcasts, or just go to steviesbrainrot.com.
Amazing. Stevie, thank you very much.
Mate, thank you.
And that's it for this week. Thank you so much for listening, and a big thank you to my wonderful guest, my lovely friend, the incomparable Stevie Webb. So, what did you think of this week's episode? What do you think of these two movies? Are you as big a fan of them as I am? Because I fucking love them. Please do get in touch. Let us know your thoughts. You can email me, evolutionofhorror@gmail.com. You can also find us on all the socials, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and Letterboxd. And if you want to discuss this week's episode and these films with fellow listeners, there are two places you can go. You can join the Evolution of Horror Discord, or you can join the Evolution of Horror discussion group, which can be found on Facebook. You can find this podcast in all the usual podcast platforms, and if you get a spare moment, I'd be so grateful if you could drop us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts, preferably a positive one if possible, as that really helps us get discovered by new listeners. So, on to next week then, and next week it's just getting even more fun as we explore that weird murky ground between home invasion and teen slasher. Next week I'm going to be joined by a brand new guest, Matt Draper, and we are going to be discussing a movie that so many people told me I should have covered during the slasher season, so I'm finally going to rectify that. We're going to be talking about The Slumber Party Massacre from 1982. Then we're going to be jumping forward 10 years to discuss a sequel to the movie discussed this week. We're going to be talking about When a Stranger Calls Back from 1993, which again, so many of you got in touch with me about and said if you're doing Home Invasion, you have to cover this film. It's even better than the original. So there you go. Join us next week for all of this and more on the evolution of horror.